Hi there, good morning. Thank you for being here today. As Tony mentioned, my name is Selby, and I'm the resident right here at the Chateau. Today I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about kind of my background and why I make art a little bit, as well as kind of a brief history of Butte and how Butte kind of relates to what I'm making as my art. And then, like it has been mentioned, I have a little activity if anybody wants something to take home that's kind of interesting. It has to do with Butte also. So first of all, I'm a sculptor, and I tend to work with a lot of concepts based off of place, history, specifically personal histories, and life cycles. I find that place tends to have a lot to do with identity and can really inform us about what our role in an environment is. So I work with a number of processes to make that, I believe that material reinforces meaning. And so I work with a lot of different processes in my sculptural work to make sure that I'm talking about the concepts that I want to talk about. With kind of those concepts that I work with, life cycle and kind of material as meaning and that kind of stuff, I tend to think about kind of how I was raised. Growing up outside of Helena, I went to work with my dad a lot of the time in Helena during kind of the summer breaks. So, you know, he was a cattle manager, so he managed the cattle for a certain ranch over by Helena. And so I grew up, I don't know that I was that much help with the cattle business, but what it did provide me was an opportunity to kind of experience firsthand and kind of touch a lot of different environments and be kind of in them rather than seeing them through windows and through pictures and just being outside and being in different environments. Something that you notice when you're really up close in different environments is, you know, when you think about outdoor environments, you kind of think about kind of the components that it's made out of. It's made out of rock and dirt and trees and shrubs and grass. But the more you kind of get in there and kind of realize it, you realize there's different species of grass that only grow in certain areas. There's different types of rock that kind of inform what can grow there or what sorts of animals like to live there. And so what I found is, like, if you kind of take a combination of all those different nuances that show up in the things that are in an environment, it makes every single place, I mean, even within a mile distance of each other, a very unique place that's got its own history and its own character based off of that selection of different components. And so I think that that also is something that applies to domestic spaces as well. Growing up back on those ranches, there were a lot of times that I was allowed to explore kind of those old cabins that were kind of left behind from homesteaders and occasionally sheeping camps. And so what you find in there is that there's kind of these traces of them trying to make a distinct place where they can feel human inside of an environment that does not feel as human. So you get those kind of ideas of them using milled lumber as kind of a material and using wallpaper. A lot of the times in those types of cabins, they would use old newsprint as kind of a wallpaper because it was, you know, reasonably cheap, and also it still kind of provided that idea that it's not just a bare bone structure. And so kind of with those types of materials, there's this distinction in trying to make a place inside of a place that's more human in its nature. And so it's kind of defined by those components as well. And so along with kind of, like I had mentioned, that newsprint, I feel like there's little echoes of private histories. You know, we always talk about kind of textbook histories and like the things that you can look up on Wikipedia and kind of learn a lot through that stuff. But I also think that there's kind of a private history to a lot of material where, like, you see wear patterns in different floors where people choose to walk and that kind of stuff. And again, kind of that idea of like using wallpaper to just make it a little less bare, or using something that I always saw was tobacco pipe tins that were used to kind of plug up holes where there would be a draft coming in from outside. And so I find that those things are really something that really makes a place have its unique characteristics while also kind of telling a brief story about the people that also inhabited that place. And so kind of with those concepts that I use as material and kind of that private history, as well as something that happens with kind of agricultural work is you're exposed to a lot more of the life cycle of birth, life, death, and decay. With it just being so close to livestock and animals and that kind of stuff, it's just something that you're more exposed to than you might normally think about in your day-to-day life. And so that's also one of those ideas that I think about, and how it kind of relates to things that aren't necessarily biological as well, because it is definitely kind of this pattern that reappears through different processes, whether they be biological or just kind of the entropy of, time. So using kind of those concepts, I use a lot of different techniques to talk about my materials. A couple of slides. Again, kind of an idea of that picturesque thing. You kind of see those pictures and you see grass and you see mountains and you see that, but you don't get the chance to really experience it until you get really close to it, and then you kind of see the things that make up that structure. Like if you look at a grass field, you might not from a picture see like that there's bones in the dirt and that kind of stuff. And I find it very interesting that once you're up close, you see that there was a carcass of maybe a deer or a horse or something in that space. And so that's something that I think about based off of that background, and kind of going forward into like the different ideas of environment, including interior and exterior spaces. And so kind of with my work, I recently just finished my BFA thesis work for at the University of Montana. And I kind of have a history of trying to talk about those same concepts of life cycle and that kind of stuff through my work. And so one of the things that I noticed about my work is that I wanted to talk about life cycles, but the first thing that I did is, since you're introduced in a lot of art worlds to techniques like one at a time until you kind of really find what you really want to do, you try and use whatever techniques you have available to you to kind of replicate it. So, at first I was using different materials like clay, and I still use paper pulp, but it's changed the reason why I use it a lot to talk about kind of those ideas. So you're just kind of replicating the concept without necessarily interacting with those materials that are directly related to it at the time. But from there, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to actually change and shift to something that's a little bit more material-based. And so I kind of switched to actually using material that was literally found on site to talk about spaces and places and objects that were on site. So kind of with that thing, that cabin there is something that's old metal stamped roofing kind of stuff, or like ceiling tile. It's one of those things, kind of like the wallpaper idea, where it was there to make it a little bit more human, I guess, and make it a little bit more cozy for people. And so I chose to take some of that material from a cabin and then replicate a cabin out of it to kind of talk about that idea of kind of building a domestic space, kind of where you end up going, and just kind of rooting yourself there and making stuff like that. And so something that I was really interested in, and I got into ink making and just using metals and that kind of stuff to just use the materials that are at the place that I'm trying to talk about with the materials that I'm trying to, that really inform what that place is. And then from there, while I still enjoy doing that from time to time and I try and incorporate it, I moved also into what I like to consider metaphorical materials. And this is kind of where I ended up with my thesis, talking about places and that kind of stuff while using some of the materials that are present in that to add context to it, while also kind of adding an extra layer of context and meaning using different materials. For example, I kind of like to talk about the fragility of a certain state of being. And so with that, you tend to want to find something that's really fragile, and a lot of the times with kind of places, it's not a very fragile substance that places are made out of. And so that's where I kind of get into a lot of my work with like organic materials that decompose over time and really kind of create just a thin film that makes it very clear that there's very little standing between it and destruction, I guess. And so that's kind of where I ended up talking about what I ended up talking about with my thesis work. I made a large-scale installation piece that was something that you could walk around and through and that kind of stuff, and it was still made out of that same paper pulping material to kind of give this idea that it's not a permanent structure. And the final idea of it is that it is place-based in the sense that it is meant to exist in a space outside where it can actually do that actual form of entropy that I find extant in most timelines of things. And so I just tried to kind of replicate that, bring in some grass to kind of give it back to that kind of idea that it's feeding this other cycle, kind of going back to that idea of cycle where decay usually is the fuel to fuel more growth in a lot of ways. So that's kind of what I was doing with that. And that's kind of where my last project ended up or finished project, I should say, before kind of coming here to my residency. And I find that there's a lot of connections to how I want to talk about place and material and ideas with Butte as a community and kind of its history. And I'll give like the very condensed version of Butte history, but originally the Butte area was kind of a common hunting grounds for the Salish, Blackfoot, and Crow indigenous nations. But it was kind of during the last 1.5 centuries that it kind of got known for its moniker as the richest hill on earth. And that richest hill on earth kind of refers to the mining processes that really kind of built this town. So Butte actually started out as a gold and silver mining camp. But of course it was during the industrialization and electrification, as I like to say, of America that kind of Butte really kind of took off and started kind of becoming its own well-established giant mining operation and area. So I mean, with the history, it's often talked about the 3 copper kings, and they were part of it. You know, the 3 companies were a huge part of kind of establishing Butte as this kind of permanent community out in Montana. And but the thing that I find the most interesting is that they were kind of not the majority of the people that lived here in Butte. I find that with Butte, it was mainly mine laborers and kind of the support systems that were there to kind of create a community and a functioning city out of the industry that was surrounding it. And so I find that very interesting in the fact that with Butte, a lot of the industry was just from one singular place with the export of copper from the area. And so with that being the case, a lot of the labor and a lot of the people in the town all had a similar job and a similar kind of station in life with how they were kind of making their living. And so what I find is that when there's a large community that's based around that and it's not dispersed over a lot of things, it allows for a lot of solidarity within a community. And so Butte actually has a really long history of kind of solidarity and workers' rights and unions in the area. And so I find that very interesting, and I think that kind of even going outside of those very official channels of unions and that kind of stuff, that Butte to this day still has and contains a really community-centric space and kind of mindset to it. And so, I think about how with Butte, in the community, a lot of the structures, there's a different kind of set of different things. So, of course, there's all of those head frames that you see throughout the entire uptown area that are really interesting to think about, and they're very heavily industry. It's not really a place that was built for domestic, ideas. But then you also have stuff that's on the other end of that spectrum with kind of, like, for example, the Chateau that was kind of built with ultimate domesticity kind of in mind, and kind of a layer of luxury in there for the people that made, the most profit out of the industry that there was. And then kind of in between that two, you have the large majority of people that lived well, we'll get to that later. But but you get the large majority of people kind of living in kind of a working class environment. And so as I'm going forward with my residency, I'm kind of taking into account kind of how that history has shaped the community at large, and kind of considering how the community has changed through the years, because of course with the mining, it stopped in the 70s, and then the stuff with the Superfund and the Berkeley pit is a large part of discussions that go on here in the community. But on top of that, kind of considering what that history means going forward in Butte's kind of future, and kind of focusing on where it is right now. And presently what I find is a very strong point is an interest in preservation of that same history, because I do believe that there's a certain pride that goes along with kind of the mining history that that surrounds Butte, as well as kind of the community that's sprung up around it that isn't necessarily just talking about the mining, but there's a lot of different things. And like Christine mentioned, there was a large art kind of ability for art in this space, and I feel like that's continuing today in a certain sense, because I know a lot of artists that have moved or have migrated over this way because they do want that community here, and there is a tight-knit community with potential to kind of ingrain yourself into the environment. And so I'm in the process of kind of building a couple of things. I'm building, I don't have pictures here, but I have a couple of pieces downstairs that you can take a look at that have to do with the structures. Again, talking about those head frames that were in the area, and kind of figuring out that the head frames were not the final step in the mining, but they are very iconic to it, and kind of using the form of it to talk about the history of the thing, and kind of using different structures to make work about the different components that I see as Butte. So, I have, again, this head frame of the mining history, as well as thinking about things like maybe, the M&M bar or something as kind of a, hub of community, and talking about specifically the community aspects and the day-to-day life of people that lived here. And maybe just kind of that sort of stuff. So that's kind of the direction that my stuff is headed in. Again, I like to work with materials that are directly linked to a place, especially when I'm doing something as place-based as working at a residency here in Butte. And so to do that, I've been kind of making different things, and of course copper is very involved in my work. And so a little snapshot, this is related to what the activity I have planned for anyone that wants to join today, is with copper, there's a really long history, and in my work, I'm trying to find a way to make copper really talk about history and age and that kind of stuff. And so one of the things that copper does in a very beautiful manner is it patinas very beautifully into this kind of blue color. And I really appreciate that color and kind of that age that it gets to it. But since I don't have 10 years to wait for the process to be done, I've kind of found a solution to kind of speeding it up a little bit so that you can have a piece kind of ready within what would take a couple of minutes if you really want to do it. So it's a patinating process where you expose the copper to just more oxidation than it normally gets to kind of create drawings and patterns on it. And so that's my activity for us to do later. And other than that, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to Butte Clark Chateau and the Butte Silver Bow Archives, Montana Open Air, my friends and family for their support, and everybody for coming here today to listen to me talk.